Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you're enjoying your second day of Oculus Connect. Now, before we start in the session on building for safety in social VR, I want to call out something that you may not have realized, but was very important to me. Last year, when I got on this stage and talked about avatars with my colleague Will, it was the first, and I thought probably the last time they'd let two British people come and talk to all of our developers. We're generally high risk, we have a propensity for improvisation, and it's a real burden on the copy team to go through all of our scripts and take out words that no one understands. So this year I was going to make the gag about the fact that Jim's also British and we're doing it again, but then the guy in the previous presentation was also English. So it's a trend. Look out. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about social VR. My name's Mike Howard. I'm the product manager for the Oculus social platform, so avatars, abuse prevention, and the hooks and connections that glue you to your friends and other people in VR. Jim is the engineering manager on the social experiences team in London, and he also comes with a wealth of experience having worked on Eve and Second Life. He also, you might notice, has a fantastic beard, which was one of the key inspirations for beard medium long in the Avatars SDK. Check it out. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Mike. A new kind of society, where thousands of people voluntarily come together from all over the world. What these people say or do may not be always to your liking. As when visiting any international city, it is wise to be careful who you associate with and what you say. This is the first thing you see when you connect to port 8888 on lambda.mu.mud.org with a telnet client before you log into the text-based virtual world of LambdaMu. While we're beginning to connect social VR applications together to build the most immersive experiences ever created, we're also following in the footsteps of networked virtual worlds, which have been building these new kind of social experiences for decades. The sense of immersion, which makes it feel like you're really with someone else in social VR, can also make it feel very scary and unwelcoming if you don't have the tools to manage the bad interactions you might have with others. Some of the new technology we're using to build social VR experiences creates unique challenges. But while the technology changes, people stay the same. Many of the problems we encounter in social VR have been wrestled with for decades, and in some cases, effective solutions have been developed. If you're interested in social VR today, you should read Julian DeBell's book, My Tiny Life, which documents how LambdaMu wrestled with crime, punishment, governance, and community as it grew into a new kind of society in the 1990s. This talk will cover some of those problems and the solutions developed to address them, as well as talking about the new challenges created by immersive VR and the new tools that we need now. Oculus is committed to building VR as a safe technology and helping developers to do the same. We'll be talking about our efforts in that space to help you as well. So, we're going to talk about the design challenges for keeping people safe in social VR. We're going to be talking about general approaches to system design, which can be applicable in many social VR experiences. Then Mike is going to talk about some context-specific design approaches. And we're going to talk about what Oculus is doing to help you as developers keep people safe. So first of all, let's talk about the design challenges. There are several different kinds of abuse and harassment you need to be aware of, and you need to be thinking about as you build social VR experiences. The first is physical harassment. This is where people are invading the social space of others, touching them, and or contorting their own avatar into shapes which are uncomfortable and unsavory. You also need to think about verbal harassment. This is likely to be the most common form of harassment and abuse in your virtual world. This is unwanted jokes, comments, or other noises that people might find uncomfortable or offensive. And this can come across VoIP as well as text chat. You also need to think about visual harassment. It's often the case that you can share media or you can share links and web pages in virtual experiences, photo sharing, video sharing. And you need to think about what you're going to do to make sure that it's not possible to share unwanted or inappropriate media. Finally, you need to think about breaking the magic circle. This is especially important in game-like virtual worlds. You might take on another identity in the virtual world. You may play a different role in your social VR experience. And in those cases, it can be very scary when people try to find out who you are in the real world and potentially meet you in the real world. When people break out of the magic circle and start trying to connect your identities inside the real and the virtual together, that can be something that's very scary and unwanted. So now I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to talk about the different types of people you might meet in social VR.
Obviously not all of them. Some of the types of people you meet in social VR are perfectly wonderful and happy people. But there are a few unsavory characters that we should think about as we think about the archetype of someone that might get reported for doing something that makes someone else uncomfortable. This is a framework that we use at Oculus, and it's also used at Facebook by the teams that monitor problems that come up where people are reported by other people on the platform. And it's a useful framework for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gives you a great way of thinking about how someone might behave as they go into an experience with others. And the other reason the framework is useful is because it gives you a way of thinking how they might respond to any enforcement or protection mechanisms you try and put in place. And those are two things that are really important to weigh up in designing for safe social VR. So the first archetype is someone who's oblivious to what they're doing wrong. This could be cultural. It might be that the norms of the situation they go into are just not representative of the norms that they would find in real life. And it might also just be that the situation is one that they've not encountered before. Someone who's oblivious, by and large, will be more willing to adapt their behavior if they're told either via an in-app warning or prompt, or just by someone leaning over and saying, hey, what you just did was wrong or outside of the norms of this environment. And this is really, really a good reason for things like code of conduct and priming people up front. Then you have the people who know the rules of the situation they're in, but somehow disagree with them or just don't think that they need to hold themselves to that standard. A really common example of this would be if you're in a situation where you've said that cussing isn't allowed and someone just doesn't think that's a rule worth having and will continue to swear. With someone who's a civil non-complier, as we refer to them, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. On the one hand, you could try and win them over with things like code of conduct explanations as to why you've put the rules a certain way to make the space safe for people. And that can be a very successful way of making these people not repeat offenders. On the other hand, if you give them the impression that they haven't been properly heard and they think they have a completely sound reason for behaving the way that they do behave, they might tend to flout their behavior in defiance of the rules and norms that you're trying to establish. And you could essentially lose someone to the dark side. Then you have the defender. This is someone who stands up for what they believe in and might occasionally jump into a situation with a bit too much gumption. That's definitely a British word they should have taken out. Eagerness to like proactively project what they believe in and potentially stand up for someone else who they believe is maybe even being abused by someone. And in many cases, it might be that they're defending too aggressively and essentially they get reported for being too strong-willed in the environment. The great thing about defenders is that if you show them the tools and the mechanisms that you've put in place to help defend, they can actually be your biggest, best actors in social VR spaces. You see this in some of our apps where you'll have someone in the room who says, hey, welcome to this space. Here are all of the mechanisms that you can use in case something happens to you that you're not happy with. And in some cases, defenders are the best candidates for that kind of person. Then you have the apologetic impulsive. This is someone who does something and immediately regrets it. Obviously, these aren't people you'd expect to repeatedly do bad things once they know that what they did was wrong. But at the same time, if you're too strong-handed in how you deal with them the first time, you might just give them the impression that social VR is not for them, that they just can't be there because they're not the right fit for the mold of social VR. And you could lose someone who, with maybe a warning, would otherwise be a fine citizen of social VR. Finally, there are bad faith actors. People call these, mostly refer to bad faith actors as trolls. People who know the rules, intend on breaking them, and indeed plan to or get a great amount of pleasure out of trying to flout the rules of the system. For bad faith actors, enforcement is really the most important thing to understand. If you do not have a way to suspend someone or deal with someone who is repeatedly causing trouble for others, they'll actually take pride in seeing a warning message that tells them they've broken some rule and knowing that nothing's going to happen. And it's really important, as we'll think about later, to deal with bad faith actors in the right way. So back to Jim for a few other complexities of social VR.
Right, so we've thought about some of the various different types of harassment we want to try and prevent inside VR. Mike's talked about some of the people, but there are some other questions we need to ask as we're building this experience and thinking about ways of making it safe. So probably the most important one is, what is the relationship between people in the environment? If you're only allowing friends to meet in your social VR environment, then in some ways it's opt-in. You potentially need fewer mechanisms for people to be able to opt out of bad experiences, because you're upfront saying which are the set of people that you're comfortable with meeting, and presumably these are people you know, and therefore people you're happy to hang out with. So that's potentially the easiest situation to deal with. You then need to think about friends of friends. Imagine you have two people in a social VR experience together, and they want to invite a third. Often you don't want to limit the set of people who can be in the environment to people who share mutual friendships with each other. And so you maybe let someone who's a friend of a friend be invited into a virtual VR experience. And so now you've got a situation where really there are two people in the environment who are strangers in the sense they haven't met each other before. But in some cases, that's mitigated by the fact that there is a route through the social graph which allows you to kind of plot the graph of the friendship. And in some ways, you're kind of expecting people to vouch for the people that they bring into VR. So again, those experiences are potentially less risky than if complete strangers are meeting. If you are having complete strangers meeting in VR, then you definitely need to be thinking about mechanisms to allow people to opt out of and filter out bad experiences that might happen, because there's no existing connection potentially between any of the people in VR, and some of those people are going to be trolls and they're going to be trying to cause trouble. So you definitely need to think about how you're going to make it possible for people to opt out of those bad experiences. So you should also think about whether there are any large-scale public events that may attract high-profile abuse. So in some cases, it's not just that people are trying to troll other people in the environment. In some cases, people are just trying to cause trouble publicly. And if you have high-profile events, if you have politicians or media celebrities being interviewed or doing a show or talking about their political policies in your social VR experience, especially if they're high profile, if they're also being streamed on the web, if they're being streamed on Facebook, then you're going to get people who are just trying to kind of get a reaction and are trying to ruin the experience, as well as trying to potentially harass and abuse the people in the environment. So if you're having high profile events, again, you also need to think about how you're going to make them safe. So you should also think about whether the environment is persistent. And in particular, if you have a persistent environment, are there going to be kind of long-standing feuds and adversarial relationships between different groups in your experience? In some cases, that's part of the design. In some cases, you're trying to create environments in which people can join different factions. Potentially, those factions are competing with each other, and that's part of the kind of drama in the environment, part of the thing that makes the experience interesting. But you should also think about, how do you keep those relationships healthy? How do you stop them crossing the line into something that's unwelcome and feels unsafe? So another thing you should think about is, can groups define their own rules for acceptable behavior? So for example, on Facebook, you can create groups. You'll have admins of those groups. Those admins will police those groups. In some senses, those groups are communities which have their own norms and define their own rules that are acceptable between the members of that group. And in some cases, you might want to go down that route, because it allows you to have kind of more nuance, and it potentially allows groups to choose their own rules, have more control over not only their relationships with each other, but actually the kind of rules of the space. And so if you can have those kind of situations, that's definitely something you should think about. It also makes people feel more empowered, because then potentially people can have a say in what should the rules of this environment be. And so instead of being in a space which has its rules which are kind of passed down to you, you can have more of a engagement in defining the rules of how that community is going to work. You should think about identity and roles. Again, especially in games, you might want to create a social VR experience which allows people to take on different identities, allows people to take on different roles in the environment. But then again, you should think about, and you should make it clear, what is role play, what is acceptable, and what is not. And so the rules of your environment need to consider not only real-world identities, but also need to consider making it clear what is part of the role play and what isn't. So finally, does your environment allow user-created behaviors? This is something I spent a lot of time working on with Second Life. If you can create user-created content, even if it doesn't allow behaviors, you need to think about how can any of these facilities be used to kind of create an unsafe environment. Even if all you can do is create unscripted objects in your environment, then people can just scatter them everywhere and potentially create situations where nobody else can use the environment just because it's too full of junk, right? So you're able to create a denial of service attack in your virtual environment just by putting too much stuff in it. So first of all, you need to think about how much stuff can be created. In environments which allow user-generated scripting and user-generated control, you also need to be very careful and think very carefully about the kinds of behaviors that you allow other people to add to your experience. In particular, you should be careful about behaviors which allow you to take control of and move other avatars around. So you might be adding these facilities to allow people to build lifts. I think they're called elevators in this country, to your virtual environment. But it's very easy to use those kind of mechanisms to trap, enclose, confine, stop people being able to move around, or potentially shoot someone off into space. And those things can be very scary because you've completely taken the control out of other people's hands that they were expecting to have. They've got used to being able to move around this environment, and all of a sudden they either can't move or they've been moved somewhere that they weren't expecting to go. So this in particular is something you need to think very carefully about. Almost every single kind of API call you add to your environment, you need to think about how can this be used to cause problems. So now we've talked about the problem a lot. Let's talk about some of the solutions. So I'm going to talk about some of the general approaches to system design, and then Mike is going to talk about some of the more nuanced, context-specific potential solutions that you might be able to use. So first of all, we're going to talk about adding a code of conduct to your experience. At the very start of this talk, I showed that even before you log into Lambda.mu, you get told this is a shared experience, and you need to be careful about what you say to people because they're real people. And also, as Mike said, one of the types of people you find potentially causing problems in these environments are people who are just oblivious to the rules. They don't understand, potentially, that the other avatars they see are real people, or they don't understand what the acceptable rules of behavior are in those environments. And if people don't know what the rules are, then they can't stick to them. So the very first thing you should think about is adding a clear code of conduct to your experience. It should say that this is an environment where you will meet other people. It should say these things are acceptable and these things are not. It should go into how transgressions are reported, what the sanctions are for behaving badly, and also what information is collected. So you're often going to find that you need information to base decisions on. If someone reports somebody else in a virtual environment, you need to think about, okay, how do I investigate what actually happened? And so you're going to need to collect some information. You should make it very clear what information you're collecting up front and that it's going to be used purely for investigations. You're not just kind of spying on people in your virtual environment. So the next thing you should think about is filtering out abuse, right? This comes in lots of forms. You might be able to mute or block somebody else in the environment. You might build personal space bubbles. This allows the enjoyable experience to continue minus the abuse. So the goal here is you're trying to provide facilities that mean people don't have to leave the environment as soon as bad things happen. They can stay there, they can manage the situation, and they can filter out the things that they don't want to see. One of the downsides of this approach is it can make the experience confusing because if I filter out Mike, but you can still see him, he might be saying something to you which I can't hear, and you end up creating these kind of subjective perspectives on the same environment. People will be used to the environment being the same for everyone, and everyone just having a different viewpoint on a shared objective virtual environment. Once you start filtering out things on a per-person basis, things can get confusing. You should also think about whether you want to make these things symmetrical. So if Mike is being abusive to me, I might choose to remove him from my version of the virtual world. But if he's still in your version of the virtual world, he might continue to be abusing me, and I can't see that, but you can. So you might want to think about, do we want to make this thing symmetrical as well? So the next thing you should think about is, who can kick other people out of the experience? This is something you need to be very careful of, because obviously this is much easier to use abusively than filtering out. If you're filtering someone out of a virtual environment, it's somewhat passive, right? I'm filtering you out, but I can continue to go about my business. Once you start being able to kick people out of the environment, you should be very careful who you give that power to, in case you accidentally give it to a troll who then goes around using it to cause more abuse. On the other hand, this is much clearer for everyone in the environment. It doesn't create this kind of problems of subjectivity, because everyone sees the same environment. Once I've kicked somebody out of the environment, it's still clear who's left. Everybody else in the experience can still see everybody else. If I kick Mike out of the experience, then we're all left in and we can still see each other, so it's not confusing. So kicking, you need to be very careful about who you give that power to. If someone is an admin of a space in your virtual environment and they can kick other people out, what happens when they leave? Who then becomes the admin afterwards? You need to think about, is there voting? How does governance work? This works very well when you have environments where people can define their own rules, because then they can define potentially how succession works and who gets the abilities to control the environment. But if you just try to have an environment where people don't have special powers, and yet some people can kick others out, it can get very confusing very quickly. So reporting is another big thing you should be thinking about. A lot of people, well, it has happened in several generations of virtual worlds that people propose that filtering is enough. That if you can filter bad experiences out, if you can kick people out of the environment, then that's enough. But it's also been shown multiple times that isn't enough. If you allow trolls to run around your virtual environment harassing other people, they might be able to filter that bad experience out very quickly if you've built good tools, but there's still that initial moment. There's still those few seconds where someone's doing something bad, and people have to see that before they can turn it off. So if there are no follow-up sanctions, if people can get away with it, then they will. They'll just run around the environment, harassing other people, expecting them to filter them out of their experience, but that's the reaction they wanted. And so you need to also provide some way to have those people reported and potentially follow-ups happening. So if you don't have this, then you'll have people who run around thinking, okay, this is okay. People can filter me out, but I can be bad to them, and that's how the environment works. There needs to be a reporting mechanism in addition to filtering out mechanisms. And this is something that's talked about in My Tiny Life. So you should read that book. So the other things you need to think about with reporting is that you are going to have to follow up on these reports. There's a cost of manual review. You are going to need to investigate these reports. You're going to need information on which you base decisions. And you're also going to need to make sure that your sanctions are effective. If it's possible for someone to just create a new account immediately after being banned from a VR experience, then your reporting flow is effectively toothless. Your sanctions aren't going to be very useful, because people are just going to go, okay, yep, I can control, get my account banned, and come straight back in. So you need to think about how you tie that to a persistent identity, or think about some way that you can't just recycle accounts to avoid your sanctions. Finally, you should think about in VR customer support. So this gives you the ability to immediately teleport to someone when they're having problems, investigate the situation in real time, potentially act on the situation in real time far faster than if they were reviewing a report. This is obviously going to be expensive, and it's difficult to scale. It's difficult to have enough people who can go and investigate these reports and act on them. But it is very effective, and it also allows you to get feedback on what people are doing in your environment, because they're actually in your environment. You should also think about whether you're going to have these agents visible in your virtual world. In the first instance, it's tempting to think, oh yeah, cool, okay, we'll have like a virtual police force, and people will be able to see the virtual police agents, and then people will, that will work as a deterrent, just because people will see people around who are trying to keep the peace. But on the other hand, if you have recognizable people with special powers in your virtual environment, then it's going to be very tempting for people who are visiting your virtual world experience to get friendly with the police force and potentially try and get favors off them. So if you make your agents invisible, then that potentially avoids that problem of corruption happening. So all of these tools can be widely employed across many experiences. And as such, they should ideally share a common interface across experiences. You want these facilities to be easily recognizable. Everyone should be able to recognize a fire extinguisher and know how to use it, even if they very rarely, if ever, need to use it. So hopefully we can build a set of user interface behaviors that allow us to make it very easy for people, whichever environment they're in, to be able to easily identify these tools and be able to use them if they need to. Now, Mike is going to talk about some of the more context-specific system design considerations.
Thanks, Jim. So Jim's just talked about some of these high-level solutions, and I'm going to dive into a few examples of things people have tried in Safety for Social VR and some of the things you might want to consider for each. The first is limiting positions and locomotion. Obviously, one of the things Jim described was physical abuse, getting in someone's face or even into their personal space. And if you have control of locomotion through either a teleport mechanism or something more akin to a chessboard where you can control where people can stand, then you have a way of stopping people getting in each other's way and potentially getting too close to one another. This works really, really well for our kind of untracked headsets like the Gear, where you know that people can't move anything except rotate, and with the 3 degrees of freedom, they needed a way of moving around the space anyway. Obviously, with hand and head tracking on something like Oculus Rift, people can get up off of their chair and walk anywhere they want in a space, especially if they have room scale. So locomotion systems don't work that well for preventing abuse, because I can just break the rules of the locomotion system effectively. And the ways you stop this happening are very uncomfortable. Throwing up a visual barrier to someone if they try and move is not really a feedback mechanism. It's very uncomfortable and will require tuning, and requiring tuning means at some point someone is going to accidentally hit it and it will be immersion breaking for them. And that's the real cost of those kind of locomotion limiting systems in sick stuff. The other thing to consider is that as soon as you have something like a locomotion system, you need to bake in rules about, say, for example, how I move to someone I've blocked, or how I might move to use something in the world. And if a single space is occupied by one person, that is a tool for trolling someone else. In old school MMORPGs, the easiest way to troll someone was to go and stand in the doorway of a room, meaning they couldn't leave the room. Or go and stand next to the thing that someone wanted to use, because only one person could be stood next to the thing that needs to be used. So using locomotion as a way of preventing abuse really does have trade-offs, and it's worth kind of being cognizant of all of these. And particularly with block, if, for example, I can block Jim and then go and stand by all of his friends, and now Jim cannot go near his friends, these things can be used in combination with the other tools you're putting into the environment to make it safe. So the flip side of limiting motion is to make it so that I can go anywhere. I just can't intersect people. Avatar protection bubbles, safety spheres, these are all methods of essentially saying, as I go too close to Jim, I will disappear to him and he will disappear to me. It's definitely worth considering a couple of things here. Firstly, we should both disappear to everyone else in the room. Otherwise, I could coordinate with someone and say, hey, Tom, am I currently in Jim's space? I can't see him, but I can still harass and publicly humiliate him in front of a room full of other people. And the other thing to consider is what you do with VoIP. It's very, very worth muting or somehow turning off VoIP as two people intersect, because otherwise I essentially have a voice in my head, one more anyway. And it's really uncomfortable in those situations to hear someone that you know spatially is right in the middle of your head. It's also worth thinking about how you present this from an interface and usability standpoint. What's the default distance? What's the default distance for a friend? How can I change the default distance to allow a good friend to get closer or even shake hands with someone while not making this a real burden on the social interactions that I wanted to have? And how do I make sure that the majority of people have a setting for their safety sphere that is actually comfortable? So in the field of proxemics, it's worth noting that they did this study, and they realized that your average Romanian person is comfortable being 140 centimeters away from a stranger, whereas your average Bulgarian person just across the border from Romania is comfortable being 80 centimeters away from a stranger. And that's a really tangible and perceivable distance. Now, I'm British, and for a Brit, the average space is 1 meter. Which, when I did this, was really, really strange. But that is apparently how close I would like to be to a stranger. Technically, I'm half Romanian, which is, again, even further away from me for a stranger, and wouldn't work in certain environments. Can you imagine being at a concert venue and everyone you had to be with was stood this far apart? And also, for Romanians, interestingly, while they were the people who preferred to be as far away from strangers, they were the people who liked to be as close as possible to their friends, only 50 centimeters away from them. Sorry, Jim, I just don't know you that well. So these things are really important to consider. It's all relevant to culture and situation, and it's worth just bearing in mind before you just turn on a safety bubble system, how it might be used, and what the considerations are for usability purposes. As VR increases the fidelity of how we represent ourselves, the third thing to consider is identity control. Your height gives a lot away about you, and so does your audio. It's very possible to know whether you're male or female or what cultural background you might have come from, and you give away a lot about yourself before you even think about names and the avatar you choose to represent yourself. So you really have to think, are there times when you would want to enable granular control or revealing of pieces of my identity? First, let's talk about audio. Audio is one of the ones which is the biggest giveaway, and audio effects can be one of the solutions here, which is essentially a mask that pitch shifts my audio or adds some kind of delay, something that makes it not as perceivable that I might be a woman with a higher pitched voice or someone from a background where my accent gives me away or something like that. Unfortunately, it's also very easy to tell when someone has audio effects applied. It's not something that can be done subtly, and in a way you're kind of highlighting someone who maybe has something to hide to the right type of mind. So the second solution is something like speech to text. If you've got good natural language processing, you could effectively give everyone who chooses to have subtitles. And so that when I interact with someone in the space, I can still talk, I can still express myself, assuming the text conversion is accurate, and create a situation where I could essentially choose to reveal VoIP as part of my identity control. The thing to consider here is that it's quite hard to follow a conversation which is half subtitles and half natural audio. So you might want to consider whether you just turn this on for everybody. Otherwise, what is the interface to turning text on and off for specific people? This definitely wouldn't work in a hangout space like Rooms, but another option, and I've clicked one too far, so I'm going to go back a second. There you go. It wouldn't work in a hangout space like Rooms, but the final option is to reduce the complexity of the social situation just down to buttons or actions that people can take. So, for example, in a poker game or a pool game, you know most of the mechanisms of how people are going to interact, and you can give people granular control over what they want to say to advance the story or the mechanic of the specific context. But again, it wouldn't work in a social space where you're trying to encourage free speech. Aside from voice, it's also then worth considering the avatar and the name of the person. It might be, for example, that I want to have granular control over revealing my named identity or my alias to you, and also my avatar's appearance. It's definitely important to think about how you make this work as a mechanic when you have multiple people in the space. How, for example, do I comfortably stand in front of all of you as Batman, but to Jim as Mike Howard, without him inadvertently revealing my identity by calling me Mike? These kind of things are very hard for people to understand, and in some regards, giving people control over their aliases and identity to different people in the room presents the large risk of breaking the magic circle, which Jim talked about earlier. There's a really interesting philosophical question here, just to kind of take away from this specific piece of identity control, which is you can do all of these things with tools to enable people to gradually reveal or expose kind of parts of their true self. And at the same time, you're essentially impacting the social fidelity of the scene. Particularly with audio, if you reduce audio down to buttons, there is no way that someone's going to have a natural language, real social VR interaction. And I don't know about you, but when I think of social VR, the thing that gets me excited is hanging out in a space and having an actual conversation with someone. So from a philosophical standpoint, you've kind of got to think, do I either try and make a reduction of social VR into parameters I can control to make people safe, or find ways to enable people to feel comfortable being themselves? And those systems are normally harder to engineer and require more governance, but ultimately I think a desirable thing for social VR. So the last example here is using creative matchmaking and standing. If you know that someone has shown bad behaviors in the past or demonstrated that they might troll other people or they work with others to troll other people, and you are in control of what space they get put into, there's a lot of things you can do. Two really popular examples in video gaming are, firstly, to put all the people with a bad reputation together and let them play in a space where they've defined their own norms, they've decided that swearing is allowed, for example, and that that's just fine. Just be really careful that you don't put a new user who's inexperienced into that space, or that, for example, you inadvertently, someone gets troll reported and then ends up in that bad space. The second alternative is to make sure that if there are people you know work together to be trolls, that they don't get paired together. But again, you run into the problems of you having too much governance over the scenario and what happens if you're wrong. And it's really, really hard to navigate these things without quite a lot of engineering work. And it's also quite difficult to make it easy to explain these people to users. So the bottom line is, everyone hopes it's possible to have some magic switch to flick. And these are 4 different approaches that we've just talked through. Every one of them is useful, but every single one of them has a trade-off. At best, it could be immersion breaking, and at worst, it could just be something that someone else can use to troll others. So there's a framework that we came up with and that we use when we think about any one of the features we turned on that I'll just walk through. The first is discoverability. It should be very easy for me to find and use the tools in a situation where I need to take some action to feel safe in social VR. You have to assume that in a bad situation, someone's going to be panicking or stressed or upset, and they won't naturally gravitate to elements of the UI that are maybe hard to discover. It's also worth thinking that even something like a universal gesture, once you've been trained on it, might be hard to execute correctly in the moment. So the fire extinguisher that Jim alluded to is really the best metaphor here. You need to make things clear and understandable and discoverable. Then there's complexity, and this is almost the flip side, which is that if you create a self-management or government system with too many rules, inevitably people just won't use it. And making a system that naturally fits the context of the environment you're in, while very, very difficult, is also a great way to make the tools easy to use and more effective in practice. A great example here is some situations where you have the ability to just mute and block everyone in the scene to create a quiet space. If the follow-on is that you have to manually pick to unblock and unmute every single person in the space, you've created something which is unmanageable. And the flip side is to turn everyone back on again, which is also probably not desirable. So complexity in the user experience you're trying to create is really important to manage. Then you have misappropriation. Jim talked about this earlier, but if you make a tool, you're inevitably giving someone power. And in that regard, you need to make sure that a troll doesn't take it and use it to troll other people. And that would normally be someone's first instinct, if they're a bad actor, to say, what are the most powerful things I can do to other people? Kicking is a great example here of not allowing your tools to be misappropriated by someone who's going to use them in the wrong way. Finally, is fairness. It's not desirable to have a tool which compromises your own experience to protect you. So coming up with ways that I feel like I can exercise safety in social VR that don't at the same time ruin or break presence or something like that is very, very important to consider as you're building these kind of tools. So let's talk about how Oculus is working to help make social VR safer. We're working on block and reporting, and these are both platform-wide tools that empower users at the system level to enable them to be safer in social VR. And we'll also talk about rooms and Oculus venues and some of the thinking we've done about safety in those specific experiences. So let's start with abuse reporting. Building reporting and enforcement systems is hard work. It requires, as Jim mentioned, manpower to be staffed for review and appeals, but also the developer time building a reporting system, setting up governance, and even policy writing is quite a burden. And it's also difficult to stop someone creating another account, coming back to your app. Enforcement at a per app level is actually quite difficult. So as the operating system of VR, Oculus has a much better understanding of who a user is. We know that they've got a certain number of apps, they might have spent money, they might have linked their Facebook account, and all of those things mean that a person's identity at the system level is much more valuable to them than it might be for a specific app. And that means that something like a sanction is actually a much more feasible mechanism to use at the system level. than per app level. We're also able to aggregate reports from multiple places, meaning that we could give you a good idea of someone's standing as they come into an app, enabling you, for example, to put them in a space where they're not near new people, or actually, in some cases, pull a lever and say, I don't think we want you to play in social VR, but the single-player mode is completely available for you. And these are definitely things that we're going to be surfacing with APIs to make it very, very possible for you to control the situation that you're trying to create in the specific context. And there's a lot of contexts, as Jim mentioned earlier. So early next year, we'll be building abuse reporting. And we're leveraging the amazing infrastructure that Facebook has developed over the years to manage reporting on its own systems. And we'll be helping to ease the burden of manual reporting, manual report review, appeals, and enforcement across the system. We're shipping an API enabling you to report a user from within an app. And we'll also be including a system-level report flow so that regardless of where I am, I could pull up the system, the fire extinguisher, as it were, and say, yes, that's the person who I'd like to report, in case they can't find it in the UI of a specific app. And the good news for anyone using the Rooms API, or even just updating the Rooms API with room information for apps which are using a cross-platform solution, is that all of those things would be conferred to Oculus users for free in those apps, because we already know who's in the room at the time, and we can populate and propagate the report mechanisms at the system level. The next up is system blocking. Having a way to say, I don't want to see you again, is very, very important. And the more consistent this feature can be, the better. We've supported blocking as a system feature for quite a while now, but it was basically limited to stopping people searching for you and seeing you in lists of users. So with the block APIs, we're essentially giving a two-way communications mechanism to apps. You can tell us that A has blocked B, and we can tell you as A enters a space that they have blocked B, C, and D, and you can respond accordingly. There's a couple of different ways that we're intending for this to be implemented. In large-scale public spaces, obviously you might not want to prevent two people being in the same space at, say, a public concert, but it's very easy to think of the mechanisms that you could use to stop them getting too close to one another, or even being able to talk to one another if one of them has blocked the other. In more intimate public spaces, the intention is to use it to stop two people being put in intimate space if one has blocked the other. And we will also be factoring that into our own system platform SDKs, in the sense that invites and matchmaking will take into account any block relationships. So if you're using matchmaking, you can turn on the option to prevent people being matched if one has blocked the other. And both block and reporting are coming early next year, I should say. So Jim's now going to talk about Rooms and Oculus Venues.
Thanks, Mike. So Oculus Rooms is an experience we built at Oculus in London and released at the end of last year. It is a space for you to have quality time with friends in VR. And as such, that means that your interactions with other people are opt-in. So the way you get into Oculus Rooms is you create a party. You can then invite your friends to that party, and then you can join them in a room together. So you shouldn't be meeting anyone you don't know in Oculus Rooms, with the exception of friends of friends. So you might meet someone who's a friend of a friend in Oculus Rooms, but in some senses, there's always a connection between everyone you should be meeting. And so we rely on the friendships that exist and the social graph that exists to expect good behavior in Oculus Rooms. And so therefore, we don't need as many of the mechanisms for opting out as in other spaces. The other thing to think about in Oculus Rooms is the Locomotion decisions that Mike talked about. So Oculus Rooms is designed for Gear VR. So it's designed for 3 degree of freedom headsets. And so we can use the mechanisms that Mike talked about, where we provide hotspots in the environment that are always spaced comfortable distances apart. So as you can see in this plan view of Rooms, you can see there's an area, there's a games table, there's a music area, there's a TV watching area, and then there's an area for teleporting into your next experience together. And each of these areas have hotspots defined around them in such a way that you always have a good view of the content. People can't obscure your view. If you're watching TV together, you'll be in an arc. If you're at the games table, you'll be in a circle. So you can always have a good view of the content you're trying to interact with or watch. And you can also see other avatars, so it's comfortable. You're at comfortable distances, but you can see people if you need to talk to them. So because it's a 3 degree of freedom experience, it allows us to both develop a locomotion system which is easy and convenient. You don't have to kind of reverse around and kind of maneuver in the space to find a good spot. But also we can make it comfortable, and we can make sure that people can't get too close and they can't invade your personal space. So the other experience that we're starting to work on in London is Oculus venues. And this will allow people to join large social experiences in VR with strangers. And we're working hard to build a social experience that feels exciting and vibrant, but also safe. So this video shows an early Locomotion prototype for venues that was made by Jonathan in London. And the goal here is to allow people to easily navigate through a dense crowd, finding friends and people with shared interests. A challenge for abuse prevention in venues is how to filter out muted and blocked people within a single large crowd rather than many rooms, and also without stopping people from being close to their friends, as Mike talked about earlier on. So these are some more design sketches by Jonathan. Another challenge for abuse prevention within venues is how to convey the buzz of the crowd while making it easy to identify and report the source of verbal abuse. So if you imagine you've got a huge room, you could have many people in this room. If one of you started shouting out abuse to me right now, it'd be very difficult for me to identify the source of that abuse because there are lots of people in the room, and for people who are a long way away from me, it's very difficult for me to identify who's caused that abuse. And so some of the sketches here show some of our ideas around avatar level of detail and audio fall-off that mean that while you feel like you're in a big crowd and there's a buzz and this is exciting because I'm at a concert, also the people I can actually hear audio from clearly and the people I can recognize clearly are all very close to me, and so it makes it easier for me to identify those people if a bad experience happens and something goes wrong. So finally, Mike talked a lot about proxemics and about how distance makes people feel comfortable. We did a lot of experiments when we were building Oculus rooms to find out the right distances between people to keep people feeling safe and comfortable. We did those same experiments or similar experiments for Oculus venues. And one of the things we found out is that we started off using the distances that are kind of understood through proxemics research to be comfortable. But we found that that didn't create this kind of vibrant, exciting feeling of being in a crowd that you might want if you're at a music concert or if you're at a sports event. And so we actually did a bunch of experiments in the real world and in virtual environments. This is the floor of Oculus London with various different distances marked out from our real world experiments. And we found out that we could, because of the social context, because you kind of expect to be nearer people at a concert or at a sports event, we could actually bring people close together or closer together while still having them feel comfortable. And that gave us much more of this kind of vibrant, exciting feel of being in kind of a big crowd at a big event. So we've talked a lot about different tools that you can give to people to manage their experiences. We're building social VR experiences where magical things can happen. People can meet, they can become friends, they can fall in love, they can get married. But the same openness that allows these new connections to form also allows negative experiences which can have big consequences. Abuse is really important to think about. If we don't provide tools to manage bad interactions, people will turn to the only tool they always have available and leave your experience, potentially forever. We can provide tools to make social VR safer, but it's unlikely that we can stop every bad experience that can happen in VR. A better goal is to reduce and deter abuse enough to make good behavior the norm and abuse socially unacceptable. There are feedback loops here. If we make it clear from the beginning how people are expected to behave, we can encourage those positive feedback loops. If we wait for the riots to start, it's much harder to set up an effective police force to stop bad behavior becoming the norm. You need to think about these things from day one. This is not something you can add on later. Finally, you shouldn't underestimate the community. We've seen powerful examples of people who spend their time in social experiences, from Altspace to Echo Arena, and before that in EVE Online and Second Life, welcoming users to a space, showing them how to use the controls, and in some cases, proactively reporting trolls they come across. In the case of Oculus apps, sharing live stream links with Oculus customer support. We need to provide tools to help people feel in control in social VR and able to help others, to build a strong community where positive interactions are the norm. Thank you for listening. I think we have exactly 1 minute for questions. So if you'd like to very quickly line up at the mic, we've got probably time for one or two. Thank you.